Historians, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? Perhaps when a tiny Spanish town wanted to make a war against Napoleon and his allies, and so declared war on Denmark. Only they forgot they had declared war on Denmark, and so did Denmark. And then in the 1980s, someone was going through records in, like, the library or something, and discovered, oh crap, we never actually made peace with Denmark. And so in the 80s, they finally made peace from their war against Napoleon in the early 1800s. Or maybe it's the tale of the army of Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein was incredibly loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor, so of course when the Emperor sends out a call for troops, the 80-man army of Liechtenstein volunteered. They went down to Italy and promptly saw almost none of the actual war. Instead, they hung out with an Italian baker a lot. When the war was over and they were being recalled home, they asked if they could bring said baker home with them. Their liege said yes, so they brought him back with them, and he served faithfully in the army until his death by natural causes. That's the story of how an 80-man army went off to fight a war and returned with 81 men. I would also rather hang out with a rad baker than go to war. But apparently that baker was then like, I'd rather go to war than be a baker. I'm Australian, and in the latter part of 1932, a wildlife management program happened and military action had to take place. So on the 2nd of November, war was declared on the emus. Locals attempted to herd the emus into an ambush. However, the birds split into small groups and ran so that they were difficult targets. On the 4th of November, Major Meredith had prepared for an ambush near a local dam, and over 1,000 emus were spotted heading towards their position. This time, they waited until the birds were at point-blank range before opening fire. By the 8th of November, only 6 days into the war, 2,500 rounds of ammunition had been fired. Considering so many shots were fired, the emu casualties were not great. The number of birds killed is unclear. One account claims just 50 birds, but other accounts range from 200 to 500. So a bunch of trained soldiers with machine guns lost a war against large, flightless birds. Ah, the Emu War. It's old news to me personally, but if you didn't know about that, it's kind of interesting. Archduke Franz Ferdinand being assassinated in 1914 led to 9/11. The Archduke's assassination, of course, leads directly to the outbreak of World War I, which in turn results in the 1917 Russian Revolution, where Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and formed the Soviet Union. Fast forward to the late 1970s, when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. In true Cold War fashion, the Americans helped local groups to fight back and drive out the Soviets. One such individual who fought along in such groups, Osama bin Laden. A regiment in the Polish army adopted a bear after its separation with its mother, and named it Wojtek. This bear carried artillery rounds to the howitzer cannon, smoked cigarettes, and drank vodka with the men. Wojtek was considered a soldier by the Polish government and given pay for its duty. The regiment even made a new patch or logo of the bear carrying an artillery shell. Ah, Wojtek, I love Wojtek. The story of Wojtek's cool as hell. In World War II, in the Pacific Theater, an American airplane was shot down by Japanese fire. There was only 9 survivors, and 8 of them were captured by the Japanese, while 1 of them escaped to sea. The 8 men who were captured by the Japanese were all tortured and killed in horrible ways, all of them dying painful and drawn-out deaths. The one who escaped almost died himself, as he was at sea for several days in a life raft with few supplies. Eventually, though, he was rescued by American forces and made a full recovery. He continued to fight in the war and survived through the rest of the conflict, and after the war he married and had several children. That man's name was George Herbert Walker Bush. Is there anyone else besides the Bushes that, had a child that later went on to also become president? In Monza, Italy, King Umberto I went to a small restaurant for dinner, accompanied by his aide-de-camp, General Emilio Ponzia Vaglia. When the owner took King Umberto's order, the king noticed that he and the restaurant owner were virtually doubles, in face and in build. Both men began discussing the striking resemblance between each other and found many more similarities. Both men were born on the same day of the same year, March 14th, 1844. Both men had been born in the same town. Both men married a woman with the same name, Margherita. The restaurateur opened his restaurant on the same day that King Umberto was crowned King of Italy, and on the 29th of July, 1900, King Umberto was informed that the restaurateur had died that day in a mysterious shooting accident, and as he expressed his regret, he was then assassinated by an anarchist in the crowd. What the actual hell? Is this like a Fear and Hunger friggin' mimic or something like that? Doppelganger? And yes, for those of you who know, I've got into the video games Fear and Hunger, and they are super good. I'm playing Terminus as we speak. But anyway, that is too many coincidences. I need to look this up. World War I, more accurately, the descent into it. After the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, there were several attempts by ambassadors and diplomats to make peace, but obviously all failed. Starting with the assassination itself that occurred after several failed attempts early earlier in the day, Gavrilo Princip's encounter with the Archduke only happens because the driver of the Archduke's vehicle takes a wrong turn onto the street where Princip is sitting outside a diner. Days after, a meeting between the ambassador from Austria-Hungary and from Russia to Serbia, intended to draft an agreement to prevent or limit military action, ends prematurely when the Russian ambassador has a heart attack and dies. Perhaps the war could have been limited to a German-backed Austria-Hungary against Serbia if it was known that no Serbian territory would have been annexed. If that was clear, Russia might not have supported her Serbian allies, but because the Russian ambassador to Serbia was dead, the only ambassador communicating with Russia was from Germany, and he doesn't know that Austria-Hungary wouldn't annex any territory. And so, Russia's full support is behind Serbia, as Germany's is behind Austria-Hungary. This means that once Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Germany has no choice but to do the same to Serbia's allies, Russia, France, and Belgium. And all three of those countries' allies return the favor unto Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire wakes up and joins on Germany's side, and so on. One wrong turn down a city street gets a ruler shot and killed, one peace negotiation falls apart by a chance heart attack, and one failure in communication drags two entire networks of alliances into war, regardless of whether or not any given country has any real stake in the inciting conflict. Not a historian, just a huge history nerd, but this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Let me tell you about the William D. Porter, a warship commissioned in 1943. It was mainly known for being the biggest dumpster fire in the history of oceanic warfare. Originally, it met up with the battleship Iowa, which carried FDR, who was going to Iran and Cairo for a summit between Allied leadership. The Porter's job was to escort the Iowa and ensure that no attack would befall on the president. When leaving port in Norfolk, someone didn't raise the anchor up all the way, which tore off a neighboring ship's railing and lifeboat mounts. The next day, a live depth charge went overboard and exploded, freaking out everyone aboard the Iowa. 2 days later, FDR wanted to see how well the Iowa can defend itself against planes, so the Iowa released a number of balloons to shoot at. Some drifted into the space of the Porter, and in a quest of redemption, shot the balloons down with no issue. After which, all of the escort ships decided to do a drill with their torpedoes. The Porter tested, but somewhere launched a live torpedo straight towards the Iowa. The Porter then tried to tell the Iowa, "We may have shot a frickin' torpedo at you, move." But the whole escort commanded radio silence, so they tried using a signal lamp. But the operator told them that the Porter was just backing up. So rather than being held for high treason via incompetence, they broke radio silence and disaster was averted. It was at that point the Iowa told the Porter and its crew to F off back home. Eventually, the crew faced an inquiry over the incident and then were exiled to the Aleutian Islands, where everything went relatively well until a crew member came back to the ship, drunk off his butt, and wanted to play with the guns. The shot landed in the base commander's front lawn while hosting a party for other officers and their wives. Their tale ends during the Battle of Okinawa, where they were tasked with keeping kamikazes away from the bigger ships. One kamikaze plane darted straight towards the Porter and was shot down before the plane had reached the ship. Unfortunately, the plane was moving so quickly, when it hit the water, it carried just enough to the bottom of the Porter, detonated with enough force to take it out of the water and sink. It may not be weird, but my god, it's hilarious. I'm no historian, but my dad is. He made me watch a documentary about the Revolutionary War and the events that led to it for summer homework. Apparently, a younger officer was friends with a native chief called Half King, who was part of a tribe alliance allied with the British. The young officer and Half King were traveling through land as they walked into a group of Frenchies. Half King, eager to show his strength to the Brits, killed them all, but the Frenchies turned out to be an ambassador and/or dignitary. They knew that this would not go unanswered, so they built a small fort, but could not build the defenses enough, so they were overtaken by the French. The French made the young officer sign the treaty on behalf of England, which was problematic because he struggled with French. He signed it, and the French waved it in England's face because it disgraced them. They couldn't let this go unanswered, so they had a war. The French and Indian War, which put the colonies in debt, and thus increased taxes, which led to the Revolution. The craziest thing that caught me by surprise was that the young British officer in the beginning was George frickin' Washington. So the general who ended the American Revolution was the same guy who made the mess. I guess if you start something, you probably should finish it. Okay, this guy blames George Washington, but is no one over here looking at Half King covered in blood and frogs' legs and the little ponytails that I think the French used to wear in the 1800s? I don't know, I'm just going off of what I saw in The Duelists, which is a really good movie. Go watch that film. It's Ridley Scott's directorial debut. Smuggler's arm shark incident. In the 1930s, a large tiger shark was caught in Sydney and put into a public aquarium at Coogee Beach. The shark gets sick and a few days later vomits up a human arm while people are watching. The arm has a tattoo that the police are able to identify as a local gangster who is missing. The police track down his associates and get a confession and solve the case. Does anyone else remember that cartoon, Kenny the Shark?